Okay, it's another Mondays, Melissa. I actually have tried to record this 3 times. I'm having some troubles with my internet, and so hopefully this one goes well. But I've gotten a lot of practice, right? I also have a little bit of a cold. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll notice I have my glasses on. If you've never seen me with glasses, you should go check me out on YouTube because I look very studious, I personally think. Anyway, I'm really excited for today. I am going to be sharing my thoughts about my interview with Matt Anderson last week. I have some thoughts, and I know that I've had a few people reach out and have asked me some questions. And so I just said, I'm going to be addressing that in this episode. I do really appreciate all that Matt brings to the table, brings to the discussion, brings to, his life experience and his view on things is really important. And I think that's one thing I'm learning as I get older is it's important for us to understand other people's perspectives, and we don't necessarily have to agree. Now, I will say I did agree with a lot of what he said in the episode, but there's a few things that I just want to touch on and have you hear from my heart, kind of where I stand on a few things. So, first, I wanted to let you guys know kind of my history with child welfare. Initially, I started working as a parent-child visit supervisor. That was my first job in the field of child welfare. And I did that for a while I was getting my master's in social work. And once I got my MSW, then I started working for the departments for CPS is what I'll call it. And so I started working for CPS and I worked there for a total of 5 years. Um, and it was probably the hardest job I have ever done and probably will ever do in my life, besides parenting. Um, and it's challenging because yes, there are policies, yes, there are rules to follow, but as Matt alluded to, and I agree with, child safety at times can be subjective, and social workers, judges, CASAs, guardian ad litems, we all can bring our own stuff into a case. And when that happens, it can affect a whole family system. And so, I was just seeing that was really hard for me to see with coworkers who were potentially doing a lot of damage to families and kids. But I also really had a hard time with the number of foster parents that I worked with that were not trauma aware, that were in it for the wrong reasons, whether it was financial motivation or because somebody said that was the right thing to do, or maybe their church said, everyone should participate in foster care in some capacity. And so they stepped into it, not really knowing what it was or not really wanting to do it, but feeling that pressure from the church or society, whatever it is. And it was really hard to see that because I was then seeing these kiddos that were kind of like, they had no choice. They had no choice. They had to be in these homes. There was no other option for them because they didn't get to choose whether they stay or go. And some of the homes, I was like, this is worse than what we removed them from. The way that they're being treated, they're not feeling seen. They're not being seen. They're not being heard. They're just like another. Um, it was just really hard. And so for lots of reasons, from, family stuff with like how much childcare cost at that point, because we had 3 kids at that point, to some of that stuff that was going on, I just decided, John and I agreed, that I would step away. And so I left the department. Um, and just felt like that was the best thing for me. And then about a year later, I was approached to work for a foster care licensing agency. So not CPS, but another agency that licensed foster homes. And I thought, you know what? This could be an opportunity for me to help foster parents learn more about trauma-informed care, learn about how birth parents are people too, and that kids should be treated a part of the family, that we need to see kids, hear kids, value kids, right? And that I can make a difference in that part. That was really hard for me when I worked for CBS. And so I started working there, and I worked there for a total of 10 years. And I do feel like by the end, I had made some good changes to that. I do feel like the foster parents that we were licensing were getting it, and we're having relationships with birth parents and encouraging reunifications, in fact, celebrating reunifications. But also on the other side, when that couldn't happen and adoption um, took place, which was a celebration in itself, but also they understood the grief and loss side of it as well. And they were trauma aware. The families we were working with were not saying the same things. They were getting it. They were seeing these behaviors. They were seeing that there was a need behind the behaviors. Now, nobody's perfect, so there was still hard moments, but I felt like there was a difference that that agency was making and hopefully is still making. But it got to a point where the department still I was seeing a lot of damage being done with decisions being made by social workers, CASAs, judges, the people that could make the decisions. On the foster care licensing side of things, we couldn't make those decisions about what happens with a child. Now, we could advocate and we could say, hey, we know this family really well. We know that they can meet these needs, or we know that they can support this birth mama, or we know that, right, we can advocate for them, but really we didn't have a voice as much as the foster parents didn't have a voice. And so it was just really hard when I was seeing more and more the damage that was being done with kiddos and their family systems, and even the foster families and the foster family birth children that were being, affected by it. Was just like this whole ripple effect of like seeing, one particular, there was actually two situations that came up that really tipped me over the edge, to the point where in December of 2019, I said, I'm done. I have to put in my notice. I gave 6 months notice because I was the director. So I wanted there to be enough time to find a new director. But there was two situations, and one was, just a foster family that I felt like was really harming a child, and how it was really hard to like feel like I played a role in that because we licensed that family, right? It's something that Matt and I talked about last week, that you kind of like have to hold this and say, I played a role in that. I had a part in that. And that weighs really heavy. Even though I didn't do it, it still weighs really heavy. And the other was seeing the department make decision about a placement of a little girl who couldn't go home because nobody knew where her mom was, and dad was not safe. And so um, there was a decision made for that child that was really harmful. And the department made some really bad choices in that situation. And to the point where I wrote letters all the way up to the regional administration, all the way to the ombudsman. And I believe there was an investigation. I believe the social worker was moved to a new position. But at that point, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I can't sit back and just watch this happen anymore. I need to be outside of this and back to what I love to do, which is help families find healing. And so June of 2020 is when I started Mending Families, and that's my heart, is to help families find healing, whether it's bio families, whether it's foster families, whether it's adoptive families. The reality is that this world has a lot of hurts, that our kiddos experience adversity in so many ways, and we need to do better for future generations. And so it doesn't matter what our family looks like. What matters is that we are trying to do better and be better for our kids so that they can do better and be better for their kids. And it just will slow generational trauma. So that's how I got to where I am today, which I just share that because there's some parallels with Matt's story as well. And kind of funny that we both stepped away in summer of 2020. But so I just wanted to share that to give you kind of a background as to like, I think that Matt's experience and my experience, kind of having these parallels, plays into why we might view things a certain way that maybe if you are a foster parent that's done this for years, and yes, it's frustrating, but maybe you haven't seen all that we've seen. And so part of that is to say, like, the conversation is hard to hear, but it's important to hear because sometimes we don't hear every side of it. Sometimes we don't hear the birth parent story. Sometimes we don't hear what is happening behind the scenes, and that the decision to do A, B, and C was actually not the social worker, but the judge, or maybe it wasn't the judge, but the social worker, or maybe it was the CASA, or maybe it was whatever, right? And so I think it's important to know that like we have a little bit of a different experience because we've seen so much in so many different ways. I also want to give a caveat that I was a foster parent at one point and we have adopted. So I kind of have played all the roles and I still feel this way. So I'm going to touch on a few things that Matt and I talked about last week that I just wanted to give my thoughts on. Not to say that he's wrong and I'm right, or I'm wrong and he's right, but more just like he shared his thoughts, I'm going to share my thoughts. And I think that's what we can do as healthy, mature adults, is be able to just hear different perspectives and have that help us grow as people, right? So, the first thing I want to touch on is my thoughts on the child welfare system. I did touch on this a little bit in the episode last week, which is that it feels like it's more broken than ever right now, and it feels like it needs to shatter so that it can be rebuilt up. I did appreciate that Matt kind of challenged that in a way to say maybe it doesn't need to be rebuilt up, but maybe it needs to look different, right? And I do believe that. I think that whatever is happening right now is not working. We went from one extreme to when I first started for the department, it was really all about like, I think actually what I'm going to say is I don't think in the 20 years that I worked in child welfare that, or almost 20 years, that I felt like it was ever about child safety. Child safety plays into it. And I do think that decisions that are being made are with the intention of child safety. I also think that people have their own lens through which they see the world. And so the way that they see child safety is one way, and maybe everyone is a different way, right? But I also think that sometimes, a lot of times, decisions that are being made, we aren't really thinking about the kid. We aren't really thinking about how a removal is a trauma. Every time a child moves is a trauma. Every time they start a new school is a trauma. Every time that you know they they feel shamed for something that they've done, that can be a trauma. Every time that they go to a visit and mom or dad is not there, or they're there but they're under the influence and the visit has to end, or it goes really well, and now they have to go back to the foster home. And for a child, that makes no sense, right? And so there's all these different things that happen that, of course, there's the initial thing that brings a child into care, but now we keep adding to it. And so I just think that we are forgetting about how this is affecting our kids. We're forgetting about how, in our attempt as a government agency or adults or professionals, whatever, that in our attempt to help keep children safe, sometimes we're actually doing more harm than good. And I think there's lots of reasons for that. It could be because the professionals themselves are not doing their own work to make sure that they are healthy and not triggered. It could be because of a system that their hands are tied and they have to do what they're told to do, right? It could be because that's the way they're trained. It could be because that they don't know different. Maybe they never took a trauma-informed care training. So there's lots of reasons why this happens, but I think whether it's removing a child unnecessarily from a birth family, like Matt talks about, or having a child linger in the foster care system for years and years and years, giving parents chance after chance after chance and trying harder than the parents to get safe for their kids, get clean, get sober, take care of their mental health, do what they need to do to reunite with their kids. That lingering in the system is also a harm. So it's this weird place of like, there is no black and white right answer. I don't think. I don't think that we can clearly say we should not terminate parental rights. We should not have a child welfare system that has foster care. We should not be removing children so quickly. But on the other side, I also don't think that we should be saying like, we should always place a child in foster care, that every foster home is better than a birth home, that adoption is the way to go, that so it's somewhere in the middle. And I think that it just depends on the situation. Um, my thoughts on trauma-informed care, Matt talked about his view of trauma-informed care kind of being like, well, if we are trauma-informed, then maybe we don't even get to the point where we are removing the kids because that is a trauma, right? And I agree with that. I also think, though, that some of that plays into if social workers are not trauma aware, I'm actually going to say trauma aware because I read the book, What Happened to You by Bruce Perry and Oprah Winfrey about a year ago. And he talks about the difference between like, are we trauma aware or are we trauma informed? And trauma aware is just being able to be aware of what happens to our brains and our bodies when we experience adversity and when they hold that trauma, right? And so if we're trauma aware, then as a social worker, I should be able to see ahead of time that making this decision or advocating for this decision or telling the judge that I agree with this decision, whatever this decision is, quote unquote, I should be aware of what that's going to do to the child, right? As a judge, I should be trauma aware to know what is this going to do to this child when I order, A, B, C, or D, whatever it may be, whether it's reunification, adoption, extended visits, unsupervised visits, on all sides of the spectrum. So I'm saying that this applies to everything, not just return home or not just foster care. I think it's everywhere, right? So if a judge is not trauma aware, to be able to say, what is this going to do to this child, to this family? If a CASA or a guardian ad litem is not trauma aware, to know like whatever they're advocating for this child could potentially cause more harm, right? And I just have seen that there isn't enough trauma awareness in the child welfare system to be able to say that these decisions are being made with the best interest of kids. And I'm going to take that back. I'm not going to say the best interest of kids. I'm going to say these decisions are being made without being trauma aware. And maybe a social worker took a trauma informed class in their graduate degree, great. But where is the required ongoing trauma aware training for our system? I talked about the documentary All Rise for the Good of the Children, that the system in Texas is really implementing TBRI into their system, and that's it right there. Can we do that everywhere? How do we make that happen everywhere? Because that is trauma aware. So that's my thoughts. I think, yes, of course, preventing removal, but also like teaching parents how to parent in a way that is trauma aware is great, but also teaching foster parents to parent in a way that is trauma aware, letting them know up front before they even have kids, like this is what it's going to look like, spending more time on what trauma is, what does it do to the body and the brain, and so they can better understand like, oh, this is why these behaviors are happening, right? Okay, enough on that. Here's my thoughts on termination of parental rights and adoption. I think that both are needed. I do not think that if we took away termination of parental rights, that all would be right in the world, only because I have seen both sides of it. I have seen situations where if termination of parental rights did not happen, a child would be caught in the system probably their whole life when there's a family willing to adopt them and keep them connected to their birth family, right? I think the bigger issue is if we are going to move to a place of adoption, we also need to move to a place of kids need to know who they are. They need to have connection with their relatives, with their biological family. They need to know, like, why do I crave milk with every meal, right? If my family doesn't, why is that? Well, maybe it's because your biological family does, and that's something to like be proud of and own, right? I think that's the bigger issue is like kiddos need to know who they are, where they come from, whose ears do I have, what laugh do I have? In the episode that I referenced when Matt Anderson interviewed Corey Best, which I would encourage you all to listen to. It's a 2-part episode. So there's 2 episodes. I'll link it in the show notes. I think I linked it in last week as well, but he talked about that when he saw his son for the first time in 19 years, that they had the same mannerisms, that they had, there was things that it was like, oh my gosh, we're doing this the same. And that's so important for kiddos to know from the beginning, not 19 years later, right? So I think that's the bigger issue. Also, of course, there's the issue of, is termination of parental rights necessary? Like, is I think that's a whole other conversation because I know it happens. I know that there's situations where parents' rights get terminated or they get talked into doing a guardianship or they are told like if you sign away your rights and let your mom adopt, then you'll get to have a better relationship with your kids because the department will be. I mean, I know that that stuff happens and that's not cool. Like I'm not a fan of that at all. But I also know that there are situations where and I asked this of Matt last week, which is like, aren't there situations where it isn't needed that humans can just be really, really harmful? And it's not fair to kids because we're not talking one adult to another adult. We're talking an adult to a child. And there are situations where to give this child a chance at healing and being able to stop a generational cycle of trauma, we have to give them a chance to be raised in a home that is trauma aware and that is going to see them and hear them and value them while still keeping them connected to their biological roots, to who they are as a person, to why they do the things they do. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. I don't think it's black and white. I don't think it's we should not do this one or do this one or whatever. I think it's somewhere in the middle. And whatever we're doing right now, I don't think is always working. It does work. But also, I do think that when you see adoption work, it's because the adoptive family is trauma aware and they get it. They understand it, right? When it doesn't work, the adoptive family is usually not trauma aware and they don't understand it and they don't get it. And they're just trying to do the best they can with what they have. So again, this goes back to the first thing I said, which is we need to do better at training foster and adoptive families about trauma awareness and about how we can actually play a role in helping kids heal and move forward and have positive self-worth. Okay, so I just feel like I am constantly evolving and growing. If you had asked me back in 2007 when I first started working for child welfare, I would have probably said "Oh yeah, it's very clear. Like we're moving towards adoption. Everyone who wants, like adoption, yay, adoption, right?" And I think that's because if we don't know, we don't know. And so we need to learn so we can do better. And I just love that about myself. And I'm just going to toot my own horn that I feel like I'm always constantly growing and evolving. And I hope that for you as well. Because if we get stuck in our ways, I can't even imagine what I would be like now if I still parented the way I did in 2007, if my work, the way that I viewed child welfare, and I knew nothing about trauma. I took 0 classes in my graduate degree about trauma. Nothing. Like it just like that was a new thing to me probably in the last, I don't know, 10 years. And so like right there, if we can, colleges, please offer more trauma aware training or trauma aware classes for the students that are getting their degrees and going to be working with these families. It needs to be a part of if you are touching the lives of kids who have experienced any kind of adversity or trauma, we got to be trauma aware. So I'm evolving, I'm growing, and I hope that for you. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of things of what I feel like you could do if you're realizing like, yeah, I'm kind of stuck in this. I'm stuck in my ways. I'm stuck in my thought processes, and I'm really feeling challenged right now. The first thing I would say is just keep listening to stories. Matt shared about a really good podcast last week. Oh, I can't remember what it's called, but it's basically adult adoptees or youth that have aged out of the foster care system or were raised in the foster care system that share their stories. And I will link that in this episode show notes so you can find it because I can't think of what it's called right now. But listening to those stories, Corey Best, listen to his story. I challenge you to listen to his story. I challenge you to listen and not cry. Like I teared up. I literally cried. I had tears coming to my face while I was walking my dog because it just is heartbreaking, but heartwarming all at the same time. So keep listening to stories. I would also say be open to learning more about a side of child welfare that you don't know. If you are a foster parent or an adoptive parent and you've never worked on the other side, like maybe try and see what that might be like. Maybe explore that a little bit. Maybe ask questions of your worker. Maybe try and get to know them and see like maybe some of the decisions they make are because they are having their own stuff, or they were raised in foster care themselves. And then it might help you better understand, like, okay, maybe this is why the decisions are being made the way they are, because they have their own bias. Not that it makes it okay, but it helps us have compassion for someone else and see the world through their lens, right? If you have never talked to a birth parent and you have never heard their story, do it. Like, listen, because there's stories out there that are you there's this misconception that if a birth parent has lost their parental rights and their child was adopted, that it's because they did that. They chose that. They, put themselves in that situation, and that is not always the case. I promise you. So listen to those stories. Ask those questions. Be willing to learn more about a part of the system that you actually don't know. And then the last one is, can we all just promote trauma awareness? Like, can we shout it from the rooftops? Can you, if you're a foster parent, can you call your social worker and your supervisor and whoever you need to and say, we need more of this. This needs to be a part of the licensing process. Because if you, as a foster parent, had more of it in your foster parent training, you may have already had a leg up stepping into this to see that there's more to this, that our kiddos are not just a level. They're not just, a level 4 or, a kid that needs to be in a group home. Like, no, there's needs behind these behaviors. And if we know more about trauma and we can understand that, that can help us better understand. If you're an adoptive family, if you never really thought about this, start now. Read The Connected Child, read The Connected Parent, listen to this podcast. I read the book, The Big Parenting Big Baffling Behaviors. There's so many good resources out there that you can start becoming trauma aware. Get your schools on board. I our school is amazing, our elementary school right by our house. And for 4, maybe 5 years, I've been trying to get in there to do a trauma training. And I finally was given the green light. And so I'm going to be doing a training with parents that go have kids at that school and helping them better understand how they can understand trauma, but then use play to work with their kids and connect and help their kids heal and grow, and that the relationship can be healthier, right? So start there, start where you see it, and start educating and give them books. Tell them about my podcast. Tell them about Robin Goebel's podcast. Tell them about, there's so many good resources out there. So trauma awareness, let's make this happen. You guys, I am fired up now and I'm going to stop. So those are my thoughts from the episode last week. As I said last week, if you still have questions or you still want to talk more about this, if the rambling was too much for you and you just want to have a conversation with me, you can reach out to me, Melissa at mendingfamilieswa.com, and I'd be happy to grab coffee with you or chat on the phone, because I do think this is an important conversation. So next week, I'm going to be answering a listener question. I had someone reach out and ask about chores. So we're going to be talking about chores next week. So I will see you guys next week for a question and answer episode. Also, next week is my 1-year birthday, the Mending Families podcast's first birthday. So there's going to be a bonus episode next week to celebrate my first birthday or Mending Families podcast first birthday on March 20th. So 2 episodes next week. I'm so excited about that. So come back for a fun, exciting birthday week and enjoy the rest of your week. Bye, friends.